Hello! Today we're going to talk about how to use a palette knife, why you might use a palette knife, and a number of different techniques that you can try to accomplish by using a palette knife. Now first, as for the reasons why you might choose to use a palette knife in your painting, normally you could use this as an addition to try and create an amount of actual texture in your work. So actual textures where you have raised blots or bumps or bits that are literally coming off the canvas. Using a palette knife to create texture is also really good if you mix in an additional material, for example, something that thickens up the type of paint that you're using, like a sand, a clay, a mud, or anything like that. Artists such as Robert Rauschenberg and Anselm Kiefer tried this in their own work as well. So we've got a number of different techniques we're going to try out, so we're going to get down to it. I'm going to start with number one, scumbling. I'm just going to pick up a single color on my palette knife, which you can see here, and what I'm going to try and do is I'm just going to try and press down on that palette knife, and I'm going to try and stretch that paint out a little bit. I've got a bit of space here, so I can try it a couple of different times. I'm obviously getting a little bit less paint on my palette knife and onto the paper each time I do it. Next up is line work. I'm going to try to pick up a little bit of paint on the side of the palette knife here. I don't want anything too much, so if there's a really large amount of paint on there, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use the side of the palette to wipe it off. And all I'm going to do is I'm just going to tap down to create some small line textures. Line work with removal. I'm going to pick up a little bit more paint. I'm going to stretch it out in a small area, like a circle, square, something like that. And then my next step, while it is still wet, is I'm going to try and use the palette knife to remove some of the lines, as you can see here. So let's try and get a few more out. So I'm trying to remove some aspects of this to create lines within an area. So next up is impasto or short impasto. This is going to be a nice big blob of paint on the end of my brush, or the end of my palette knife, I should say. And I'm going to tap it on to create a bit of a raised texture here. Longer impasto is the exact same effect, but rather than just putting it on the end of the palette knife, I'm going to pick up a little bit more. And again, create those big blobs as I go. Last but by no means least is the gradient that we're going to try and create. I've got three different colors here. I've got dark blue, light blue, and a white. I'm going to try and get any of the extra paint off my palette, or I can use my finger just to wipe it off. Then what I'm going to do is 1, 2, 3. I'm going to get a little bit of the paint on my fingers, and I'm just going to wipe it onto the palette knife like that. So it goes from dark blue to light blue. Move this out of the way. Put my finger on the palette knife, and I'm going to try to press down and spread that out, which creates a bit of a nice gradient texture from the light to the dark. Hopefully you've been able to put something together that looks a little bit like this with a range of different techniques. Please remember to number and label them as you go through, because we want to make sure when we are talking about work later, if we're using about a palette knife, that we are using the correct terminology. Well done, good luck, and I can't wait to see your work soon.